Sujoy, you've been telling us about the turning point where people suddenly realize that solar doesn't have to be on the fringe. It is in effect coming to the mainstream of India's energy consumption basket. Was it also good timing in some ways, apart from the fact that the Narendra Modi government made a big push on this, that there was a coal shortage in India and people thought that perhaps renewables and solar was the shining knight in white armor. Is that something that happened really?
Well, I would say good timing from an international standpoint, because the solar industry historically was serving Europe. And round about the 2009-10 timeframe, we saw economic contraction in Europe, which directly impacted the very high subsidies the Europeans were paying for solar power, which was inherently expensive at that point in time as compared to normal options they had on the grid, right? That caused a glut in the solar manufacturing side of the value chain, which caused a decline in equipment pricing. And that was round about the time the Indian industry was scaling up. And so there was a benefit to the developers, which saw tariffs in solar reduced from 17 rupees 91 paise in 2010 to now bids coming in at 4 rupee 34 paise. And no other industry has witnessed probably such a dramatic decline in tariffs in the power sector as solar has.
So that made people, especially in the state governments, more comfortable with solar?
Absolutely. I think, as with any commodity, in a macro environment where we still have demand and supply imbalance, we have more demand than supply. As soon as the pricing becomes more competitive, people would, demand would increase, and that's exactly what happened with the solar industry as states became more and more comfortable that this is not going to impact their ARRs. However, Pranjal, as you would know, I think the problem in our country has never been generation capacity. It's always been the financial health of the distribution companies, which are the primary consumers for any form of power. And so we've seen a lot of stranded assets in the thermal side of the business. And more recently, we've seen in wind projects where developers having operating assets have been asked to back down because the distribution companies are unable to procure the energy, even though it's available at a competitive price. And I think that remains probably a larger challenge for the sector overall. Yes, the government has recently come out with the Uday scheme, which in my mind would be the second turning point, which tries to address the root of the problem, which is the imbalance in the finances of the distribution company.
At least clean up the books of the state electricity boards.
Absolutely. And I think the future growth of not just the solar industry, but the overall thermal generation industry would be dependent upon the success of the Uday scheme and also on the ability of the grid to be built fast enough to take care of this sudden increase in the capacity.
In the mind of the consumer of electricity, the institutional or the individual consumer, today it doesn't really make a difference because if I switch on the light, the power comes. I don't really care where it comes from, whether it's from hydro, whether it's solar, or whether it's thermal and coal fired. Is there a need for in India for the consumer to be aware? Do you think that will make a difference in terms of the demand, in terms of the clean energy that is option for consumers? Does that make a difference?
Well, so the way the electricity market is structured in India, the primary consumer is the bulk consumer, which is the distribution companies. Right. And distribution companies are obligated under the renewable purchase obligations under the Electricity Act to procure a certain percentage of the solar energy on an annual basis. So there's already an awareness created. Retail consumers is a very different thing, right? Retail consumers today, we see a segment which is emerging, which is the residential segment where people historically used to take inverters for backup power. I think now they're moving and switching options to solar and using the solar panels to charge inverters.
Is that something which you see as an important segment of the overall market?
Well, right now, just given the scale at which the bulk projects are happening, the retail end of solar is going to remain very small. The challenge for the retail end is going to be how do you scale it and how do you attract institutional capital? Because solar is capital intensive, it's all front loaded capital. And unless you have low cost financing, the retail segment will not really develop.
In theory, it is possible in the coming years for, let's say, the entire the housing market or the commercial real estate companies to possibly have an institutional arrangement with developers like you?
Yes, in theory it's possible. I would say one more thing which would add to that would be the emergence of storage. Right. Because as soon as you have storage which is available at competitive rates, solar is extremely scalable, right? So you can build solar plants and for like 1 kilowatt, right? And you can build solar plants for hundreds and hundreds of megawatts. So you could have individual consumers creating their own energy, but as long as they're able to store it and become independent from the grid, then you would see that segment also, becoming something of scale.
What is the turnaround time and the effort for setting up a solar power farm for, let's say, 1 megawatt from concept to finish when it starts generating?
Well, these days, from concept to finish would be about 12 to 15 months for large-scale solar projects. The biggest time, ironically, is taken in acquiring land and acquiring the right-of-way for the transmission corridors to connect the plant to the grid.
The evacuation
lines. I think constructing the solar plant, as long as you have possession of land, people do 1 to 2 megawatts in a week. So the plants can come up very quickly.
So the plant itself takes only a couple of weeks, but it's the land acquisition and taking the power from the plant to the grid,
yes,
which is a problem.
And it's not a problem, but those are things which take longer. The third thing which takes a lot more time is the financing arrangements. And so, you have to work your way through getting the loan documents done, getting all the diligence done from the lenders, which takes time because most large projects developers bring in the equity capital, which is about 30%, and the balance 70% is available from banks on long-term financing. But raising that capital does take more time than